Hi, welcome to Books on the Go. I'm Anna and I'm here with a February wrap up and just an update. So I thought I would wrap up the books that I've read in February so far. And first of all, a couple that I bailed on. One was The Last Children of Tokyo by Yoko Tawada. And I don't have that with me because we've had such a big tidy up this month because of a party that we had last weekend that I've actually donated that to the library already. So I've been too efficient for my own good because I don't have it to show you. But this was a very small book and really, really well written about a future dystopia where the children of Japan have been almost all wiped out, and there is the old people and the really old people. There are different names for them, and that's not something I'm normally into. So it makes it, for me, a bit harder to get into because you have to get your head around that before you can sort of immerse yourself in the story. So unless the story really grabs me straight away, I find that another hurdle to get over. But this was a case of, I think, just it wasn't the right time for me to read something. It's quite bleak, and even though you could tell that it was a really well written book and it's a good quality, high quality book, I just couldn't get on with it. So I started reading it a month or two ago, wasn't gripped by it and put it down, and so I picked it up again a couple of weeks ago, and again I just wasn't wanting to pick it up and wasn't drawn to it. And I thought, and I kept it because it's a beautiful small book that is, I think, a really accomplished work, and for the right reader it would be a beautiful read. But because I just wasn't enjoying it, I let it go. So in my tidy up phase, I thought I'm just going to move that on. And then another one that I don't have with me that I didn't adore, although I was so excited for it, was The Seven Deaths of Evelyn, Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. So this is his debut crime, and it's a body-swapping Agatha Christie style crime murder mystery set in an old house in the past, I think. And it just, that was doing so many things, and the body swapping element. So it's Aidan Bishop who wakes up in the different body each day. But it's the same day again and again, and he's trying to stop the murder of Evelyn Hardcastle. So you're trying to do, I felt like it was doing too many things for me, and therefore what that meant was, I've heard Stuart Turton interviewed. He's lovely to listen to, and he said he worked really hard on the plot, and he had an Excel spreadsheet of where everyone was at different times, which room of the house that they're in. And what happened to me was that because it's doing so many things, I felt like it was the result of an Excel spreadsheet, which is not how, in other words, I wasn't enjoying it as a read, and I wasn't sort of swept up in the story because I couldn't actually keep track of which body Aidan Bishop was in, because he then he'll be in one body, but then in the same day he might then swap back to be the butler again or another person, and then it will go to day 2, but then day 5, and then back to day 2. So if it had just been a more straightforward progression from one body to the next, I think I could have followed it and then really enjoyed the mystery of who killed Evelyn Hardcastle. As it was, I was getting frustrated by the mechanics of it. And then the mystery of who killed Evelyn Hardcastle, I never quite even attempted to figure that out. And then Simon Savage from Savage Reads has pointed out he doesn't ever go into a woman's body. So the women become very much secondary characters, and they're sort of damsels in distress. And so that didn't appeal to me. And then what I did was I ended up just skimming through to the end, and it was maybe because I hadn't read each and every chapter, but it just seemed very complicated. So I don't know. I was really, really intrigued. So I'd love to see what he does next, because it was such a great idea. But no, it didn't quite stick for me. And then onto some books that I have quite enjoyed. One is Travelling in a Strange Land by David Park, and I spoke about this in my Evita book tag video, so I won't say too much, but we did this for the podcast for Books on the Go, and it is a really beautiful, sad book about a man who's travelling through the snow to pick up his son, but thinking about his other son, Daniel, and then going back into the story of what happened with Daniel. And it is really slow at the start, but still quite spare, so it doesn't drag, but it just slowly moves towards, as he's slowly coming to terms with his memories, and then it builds and builds, and it becomes really compelling and page-turnerish almost, as you get really drawn into that story, and then it builds to the most beautiful ending, really stunning. And so it's one of those books that I read and then it has haunted me a bit. I have been thinking about it since I finished it, and I did a blog post actually, because this one and the Kyung Suk Shin book that I read last month, Please Look After Mother, both of them dealt with family and parenthood, and both of them had these really sublime endings, which is good because sometimes the ending of a book can disappoint you, whereas these, I think the ending was almost the highlight. So that was Travelling in a Strange Land. Then I read the Fragments by Toni Jordan, and we've just done the podcast for that this morning. And this is an Australian author, so she's written 5 novels and been shortlisted for various awards, and this is her latest. So it's the story of Caddy, who lives in Brisbane, 1980s. She's a bookseller. She's sort of treading water a little bit. She rides around on a bike and she's a bit daggy, and she's quite quirky, and one of her quirks is she's obsessed with the writer Inga Carlson, who's a fictional character who lived in the 1930s and died young, and had this enormous success with one book, and then died before her second book could be published. And indeed she died in a fire which was in the warehouse where all of the manuscripts of that second book were, so that it never got to be released. It was never seen by anyone other than her and her typesetter, because she was so private about it. So it's this sort of mystery of the lost second novel, if you like, and there just a couple of fragments survived, and they're now doing this sort of world tour in the 1980s, and it comes to Brisbane. So the novel starts with Caddy at the exhibition, which they're accused of people for, and she meets an older woman called Rachel who quotes a line from the Fragments, but she completes the line, which intrigues Caddy, and to the point of she becomes obsessed with wanting to track down Rachel, who's sort of sailed off in a taxi, and find out where this other bit of the book is, or indeed whether Rachel has the whole manuscript somehow, and if so, how that has come to be. And she's joined by an antiquarian bookseller called Jamie, and then a sort of nasty academic called Philip, who become competitive about solving this mystery. And then it also goes back to the 1930s, where you meet Rachel as a young girl, and she meets Inga Carlson, and they have a relationship. So I really enjoyed it. It took me a while to get into, because I found the premise of it, that there was this huge mystery and obsession over a lost second book, a bit hard to believe. So I didn't get swept up in it as a result, because I found it a bit contrived, and that's just might be me being cynical, or it's a thing that I don't like, books that are too much about authors and booky things, because it seems too insular. And I don't know if that's just a thing that I have, or whether if you find that, tell me in the comments below, because I don't know if it's just me, but I found it a bit hard to believe. But then I really got into that story, the Brisbane one, and it's a very, easy read, and it has a lovely warm tone, and she sets the scene of Brisbane really well. But I actually found the New York story a bit more organic, and I really enjoyed that. It just didn't feel as forced. It seemed, admittedly, not as much dramatic action happens, but it did, to me, it felt more of a natural story where you're just following these two characters, and the mystery does build. The ending threw me a little bit, so I won't say any more because I don't want to spoil anything. We talked about it a little bit on the podcast, but it's a bit twisty. That's all I'll say. But it's a good book. So The Fragments by Toni Jordan, and it was a bit inspired by the Harper Lee issue of when the Ghost Set of Watchmen manuscript was unearthed, and also around that time Toni Jordan said she heard about the unmasking of Eleanor Ferrante, who had wanted to be anonymous, and so those sort of ideas were playing in her mind. So it's a really interesting, there are some interesting themes in the book. So that's The Fragments. And then one that has had a lot of hype, which is Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, and we're doing this on the podcast next week. So, and this was a Reese Witherspoon book club choice, and I think she's adapting it for the screen, which will be really good. I can see this on the screen. For me, the book itself was a bit slow, but it's been compared with, somewhere here, it's been compared with Barbara Kingsolver and another author, Celeste Ng, and I think they are good comparisons, actually. So if you do love Barbara Kingsolver and Celeste Ng, and I know Reese Witherspoon had picked Little Fires Everywhere as well to adapt, I think it was. So it is a reliable guide. I think it has that sort of flavour. And the Barbara Kingsolver, because it has a real focus on the natural environment, and I think Delia Owens is a wildlife scientist. I might have the title wrong, but she has worked a lot with wildlife. She's lived in Africa in sort of jungle environments, and so she really knows her stuff as far as that goes, and that shows through, and it's not done too heavy-handedly. But this is the story of Kaya, who lives in the swamp or the marsh in North Carolina, and because of dysfunctional family issues, she ends up living there alone, and she somehow survives. And then she meets a boy called Tate, and she also meets a boy called Chase, who's sort of the local football star in the town. And I think at the beginning, or near the beginning, you find out that in the future years Chase has died, and there's a mystery surrounding that. So occasionally it flashes forward to the sort of 1969. Chase is being found dead. You have the two police officers eating donuts and trying to work out what happened to him. And then most of the story is back in the 1950s and 60s, where you follow Kaya growing up, and it leads towards 1969, and she's arrested for his murder, or she's the chief suspect. And you follow that through to sort of ultimately find out what happened and why. So it does have that sense of mystery. I found overall it was a bit slow for me, but it is really beautifully done. Some of the writing's quite exquisite, and I can see why. I mean, I can really see it on the screen. I can see why it would have been picked up for that. But some of it I didn't quite believe. And then the story, I mean, there's just not much of a story. The story, such as it is what happened as between Kaya and Chase, or what might or might not have happened in terms of was she involved with his death. But it didn't seem quite enough to sustain, this sort of over 300 pages for me. But if you enjoy the nature writing side of it, I think it's also just about that and immersing yourself in nature as she does, and she sort of prefers that to living in society with other people. And I liked her as a strong female protagonist. She's a really singular character. So yeah, it does have a lot going for it, but it didn't completely grab me. So that it's a bit hard. I'm still thinking about it. So yeah, I'll see how I go after a few days thinking about that one. I just finished that yesterday. So that is Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, and I will have to run away now. But I would love to know what you've been reading in February, and I will see you soon. Bye for now.